Here in the West, we're facing a new religion, in a sense, that's seeking to destroy the Judeo-Christian culture that we have. And it's something we really need to talk about because it is around us. Hi, I'm Gary Zacharias, and this is the Apologist Bookshelf. What am I talking about? Well, they said, this is the author speaking here, it's nothing less than a kind of cultural acid eating away at the central pillars of a free and open society. So this is titled A Toxic New Religion. Scott Allen and Daryl Miller with Stan Guthrie are the authors. I did a previous podcast on that. I did the first two chapters. Number one was called What's Wrong with the Story. Second one is called The Assault on Western Civilization Begins. So this is something that we're facing that we need to think about. And I thought maybe we'd do, just keep moving, just do chapter 3. And this is called The Birth of the Modern. We'll see if I get going and I want to keep moving. Maybe we'll do chapter 4 as well. But anyway, it says, so he's going to give us a quick look at modernism and postmodernism and how that came along to disrupt Christianity. So he says if you go back to British empiricists like David Hume in the 1700s and Darwin, that gave rise to naturalism, or sometimes called materialism. In other words, what's reality? It's just physical. You just look around. Whatever you can see, whatever you can measure, whatever you can put in a test tube, that's what's real. And science, therefore, is the only way to learn things. Of course, that's scientism. And we hear that today with Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, as well as others. And he gives, I like this, I say him, I think Scott Allen did most of it, I'm not really sure. Anyway, so Allen and Miller give an example here from the New York Times. Nicholas Kristof, he says that universities overwhelmingly do discriminate against evangelical Christians when it comes to hiring the faculty because they want uniformity of thought behind their narratives. That's kind of grim, isn't it? Neil deGrasse Tyson, now he's another one who's going to be a materialist. He said, every account of a higher power that I've seen described of all religions that I've seen include many statements with regard to the benevolence of that power. But then he says, when I look at the universe and all the way the universe wants to kill us, I find it hard to reconcile that with statements of beneficence. So he said that goes back a long way, this narrative, going back to the European Enlightenment and basically trying to discredit Christianity. And it became kind of a secular religion, this materialism. He says Darwin became the great high priest. Why? Because he overthrew the need for a creator God. And he said we can get from one-celled animals to us through a naturalistic account. All right? We start with one cells. We get life here, and then we get the one cells. Of course, Darwin never got into how even life came to be, but once you got life here, then it evolved. And now here we are, diversity and everything. Now, here's part of the problem, which the authors admit, that this story that we're hearing from the materialists is that there was a weariness over religious warfare back in the late Middle Ages between Catholics and Protestants. Yeah, and no doubt. And they said Darwin's theory also gained some traction because it did seem to be a lot of evidence for adaptations within species. And they gave an example here. There's a famous example that Darwin came up with talking about the Galapagos Islands. There were finches there, and their beaks did become either longer or shorter depending on what the climate and the food availability was. Okay, well, the finches, it wasn't like one finch had its beak grow and then come back. It was ones that were born with longer beaks would do well in a certain climate, and then ones born with shorter beaks would do well in other climates. But anyway, they went on to say that story of materialism succeeding thanks to the fighting of the Protestants and the Catholics and thanks to Darwin and all, he says that narrative is distorted. Why? It paints Christianity as anti-science. He said, but really there were deeply committed Christians like Bacon and Newton and Copernicus and a lot of others, and they founded modern science. That's something I just hope you all take away from these podcasts when it comes to scientific issues. We are a scientific culture, the West, not despite Christianity, but because of Christianity. And I've done talks on that, and I'd be glad to send people information. But I want us all to be proud. We live in a scientific age thanks to Christianity, not despite it. So that's really crucial. It says, it says it takes a lot of faith to look at the inner workings of a cell or an eye or in a galaxy and say, oh, it just happened in a purposeless universe, had no ends in mind. No. It says Christianity explains how humans can use reason to inquire into creation. And then to get into evolution for just a minute, because remember, Darwin is using that as a way to bypass God. So is evolution a proven fact of science? Well, they said there is microevolution, no doubt about it. You do get changes and adaptations within a species. And I want to stress that. But there's no evidence to see one species turning into another. That's macroevolution. So when somebody tells you they believe in evolution, we could say, what type of evolution do you mean? We believe in evolution too, as far as within a species. Now, people who are going to back up macro, one species turning into another, they'll say, well, it has to be true because it's the only way that you could get life forms to change without a supernatural creator. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have no doubt. I would believe that too. If I thought there was no God, then yeah, I'd be a materialist, and then I'd believe in evolution. Now, they quote from Richard Lewontin. Now, this is a wonderful quotation. He's an evolutionary biologist from Harvard, not a Christian. He is a materialist. And here's what he says. This is famous. I've seen this in several books. This is Lewontin speaking. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Isn't that interesting? So he says, we believe all these things not because we think the evidence takes us there, but because we are committed to materialism. So if there's no God, how did we get here? It'd have to be materialism. It'd have to be evolution. And they point out that that's scientism. He said that's a pillar of this toxic new religion, according to these authors. Scientism. It's a secular religious faith. So what is it? One more time. It's the idea that science is the only legitimate way of knowledge. So since there's no God, there's no soul, there's no free will, we can't know any of those things. It's only science. If you can't put it in the test tube, if you can't measure it, if you can't take a picture of it, then it's false. So these authors are pointing out in this book there is not a war between science and Christianity. No way. There is a conflict between Christianity and scientism. Those are two metaphysical truth claims. So he said there again, we've got that false story that there's some kind of war between science and religion. They're saying that's not true at all. Okay, let me pick up. I think we've got time. Let's do the next chapter. It's called The Birth of the Postmodern. So far they've been talking about all the twists and turns that Western civilization took since the days of Christ and the Roman Empire. They began as taking Greek thought and Roman law and Judeo-Christian ethics and worldview, which we've covered in the first two chapters in a previous podcast. Then came the Enlightenment, and it was saying it was a scientific alternative to the Christian worldview, and it became atheist in its orientation. Okay, well, let's keep going. So it said there's another stream in this atheist branch. We just heard one stream, which was this idea of materialism, that evolution is true and all this kind of stuff. But a lot of people were upset with that. They were reacting to it, that reality is grounded in the mind, they said, not out in the world. You get Karl Marx, who comes along in the mid-1800s. So what did he do? Well, he replaced religion. He came up with a social and economic theory. Sometimes it's called dialectical materialism or just Marxism. And what did he have to say? Well, Marxism is primarily focused on power, oppression, class, and economics. Now, out of those four, are you hearing three of those over and over again in our society today? Yeah, everything's about white power. Everything's about oppression. Everything's about what class are you part of, what group do you belong to. Even the economics, I guess, would be part of it too. So Marxism is not dead. It's been transformed. But anyway, so back to what the authors are saying here. For Marx, economics was the key driver of history. And he saw Christianity as used by the powerful and wealthy people to put down the working class, keep them under their thumbs. Then we have a man named Gramsci, came out late 1800s, early 1900s. He was a Marxist. His full name is Antonio Gramsci, Gramsci. He was a Marxist and an atheist. And he viewed art and literature and all these other things beyond what Marx looked at. Everything he looked at in the idea of a class struggle. And so he insisted that Marxists had underestimated the importance of institutions like the media, universities, and churches to deciding who's going to control society. Well, again, do you hear echoes of that today? Look at what's happened to the media. It's been taken over by the extreme left to the detriment, I think, of a lot of Judeo-Christian principles, and universities. They've been taken over. So Gramsci thought that all those cultural institutions weren't neutral, but they're actually a propaganda machine for capitalism. And so now he says, we've got to, this is Gramsci that was talking about marching through those institutions and taking them over. And so now you got humanities departments, you got social science departments, journalism schools, and a lot of them are into this Marxist and Gramsci ideas that they're hidden oppressors. I mean, again, do you hear that a lot? There are oppressors. You're being oppressed. You're an oppressor. So critical theory has actually taken over a lot of the humanities in colleges. It's a discipline that's taken over the old idea of history of Western civilization. What's it trying to do? It's trying to expose or unmask all sorts of subtle racist ideas, sexist ideas, homophobic ideas that are inside our systems and our structures within our culture. So what they would like to do is tear down capitalism. Well, how do you do that? You have to tear down the cultural foundations that capitalism was built on. So for Gramsci, one more time, culture was usually, he saw it largely as a Judeo-Christian stream of Western civilization. So the family, he looked at what's holding up this Judeo-Christian worldview, what's holding up Western civilization, the family. So then he expanded who the oppressors were. Well, yeah, they were capitalists, sure, and property owners, oh yeah. But then he changed it or moved it toward what he called the patriarchy, and they oppressed wives, and they oppressed children. And then you get rid of the bad guys in that time, the bourgeois. Then they were replaced by another class, white, heterosexual, Christian, or Jewish males. They were the problem. So kind of ironic, isn't it, that Gramsci and Marx were white men. But if you happen to be a white male, you're woke. If you confess all your evil by being part of this oppressive group and admit that you got white privilege and admit that you're unconsciously racist and sexist and so on. So that's what we've got going on here. You got to be critical of U.S. history if you're going to go after Judeo-Christian values, because it was shaped by capitalism and the stream of Western civilization that really did adhere to Judeo-Christian beliefs. So you got to go after U.S. history. Who did that more than anybody else? I've heard of this guy several times, Howard Zinn. He has shaped today's American students and how they understand history. And guess what? He was a disciple of Gramsci. So there's kind of I would say, a disregard for truth that's going on. And there's a quote here. It's an open letter to a Pomona College president. 3 black student activists wrote this. Historically, white supremacy has venerated the idea of objectivity and wielded a dichotomy of subjectivity versus objectivity as a means of silencing oppressed peoples. Isn't that interesting? So they're against objectivity, they say, that's been done to silence oppressed people. Let's go back to these 3 student activists. The idea that there's a single truth, the truth with a capital T, is a construct of the Euro-West that's deeply rooted in the Enlightenment, which was a movement that also described black and brown people as both subhuman and impervious to pain. This construction is a myth, and white supremacy, imperialism, colonization, capitalism, and the United States are all of its progeny. The idea that the truth is an entity for which we must search in matters that endanger our abilities to exist in open spaces is an attempt to silence oppressed people. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. But how powerful, I'm done with the quotation, but how powerful is that? That people are looking today as things like capitalism or the U.S., the whole U.S., that there's truth out there and that we ought to seek the truth. That's an attempt to silence oppressed people. Wow, that's amazing. Now, the logic can't be refuted. It really can't be refuted. I mean, if you go after them and say that's not true, then you're evil, or you're a dupe, right? You're the one who's trying to oppress people. They said it's flourishing in big business, it's in law, it's in entertainment, government, all sorts of spheres of activity. And then there's a quote from a man who's examined this: the vast structures of cynicism which Gramsci's ideas have built, which honeycomb Western society today, will prove much tougher to dismantle than the crude cement blocks of the old Berlin Wall. Wow, isn't that something? So it's produced cynicism, right? You look at the United States and you go, yeah, I don't believe anything about it. I don't believe in the political system. I don't believe in the economic system. So you've got all of this cynicism. They said it's going to be really difficult to dismantle. Now, there have been other postmodern thinkers, but these authors are pointing out Marx and Gramsci. So they rise above the rest. They have a deep influence in the toxic new religion. Why? Well, let's talk about critical theory for just a minute here. What are the today's objectives and standards of people who buy into critical theory that's all over campuses? Well, first, it has an obsession with power, oppression, and victimization. You divide the whole world between oppressors and victims. There's nothing outside those two categories. So it's all about grievance. It's all about victimization. Number two, here's something else you hear through the critical theory people: a fixation on your class or your race, your gender, your sexual orientation. That's how you identify yourself, right? So you don't identify yourself as a child of God or as the son or daughter of somebody. No, it's all class, race. Like what box do you belong in? Here's a third characteristic of critical theory: great hostility toward the Judeo-Christian belief, especially about the family and sexuality. Here's another bit of hostility: it's toward capitalism. Why? Well, they equate that with greed and imperialism and oppression. There's a driving passion they have to redistribute wealth. And how do you do that? You need a huge state. You need a huge governmental body. So you want more government to pull apart wealth and hand it out what they see as the correct way. There's an antipathy toward the natural family. They're really down on authority. They don't want parents to be in charge of kids. They don't want the authority of a husband or a father in the home. And then finally, here's another characteristic of critical theory: a rejection of absolute truth or absolute morality. And they have an ends justifies the means approach to getting what it wants. So can I go through those real quickly one more time, because that's what we're seeing today, and this is what we're up against. An obsession with power, oppression, and victimization, a fixation on class, race, gender as a way to define who you are, hostility towards Judeo-Christian beliefs, hostility towards capitalism, a driving passion to redistribute wealth. And how do you do that? A huge state. Antipathy toward the natural family, and a rejection of absolute truth or absolute morality. So this is what we're seeing. This is what's going on around us here. I'll finish up the chapter. Give me maybe another minute or two. So everybody is defined in this philosophical materialism in physical terms. We don't have a soul. We don't have a spirit. We're a machine. And so we get to define our own reality. That's the postmodern view. The death of God is what's happened. We've pushed God out of our society, and they point out that leads to the death of man. Either he gets devalued in his spiritual nature, or maybe even his body gets devalued. That's postmodernism, right? You don't think about your body. It's your human mind. That's where your power, and that's where reality is defined. The death of God leads to the death of man is the image of God. Remember in Genesis, we're created in God's image. Well, if that's not true, if we toss God out, we're gone. We're just an animal. If God is dead, then men must die. We're losing respect for human life. And are we seeing that today? Yeah. Man must die. Abortion, infanticide, mercy killing, homicide, death with dignity, which is killing the elderly, suicide, killing women, because you want to have more males in your society. It's only the Judeo-Christian theism, they say, that led to the concept of universal human rights. Isn't that something? I mean, that's really valuable. So this is what we've done. We've gotten rid of God. So now we can define our own existence. We can get rid of the reality of biology. And C.S. Lewis called that the creation of men without chests. What did he mean? He said, this is C.S. Lewis, in a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. That's the absurdity of the life that we have right now. We've proclaimed God is dead, and then wonder why it's ruining us as well, because we're the only beings in the universe created in his image. So that's chapter 3 and chapter 4. We just need to, first of all, know what's going on out there. I have a talk on just critical theory itself, and you're certainly welcome to take a look at that. I can send you a PowerPoint of what I covered so that you don't just feel frustrated with the problem, but we talk a lot about some solutions. We talk about the problems with critical theory. So I appreciate you being part of this podcast. And don't get discouraged. God's in charge. You can't live as if there is no God. It leads to a pretty miserable life. So we have the answers, and we know that it will work out. And as we watch our society fall apart, we need to be there to pick up the pieces, because people trying to live a life without God are going to be frustrated, and it's going to lead to some pretty tough situations. So we need to be available. We need to be there for spiritual help, whatever we can do. All right, well, thanks. I hope you're having a good day. Talk to you later.